All right, let's dive right into this explainer. If you ask someone what the Kaaba was before Islam, they're probably going to tell you it was just a pagan temple stuffed with 360 idols. But modern history shows us something way more complex. Today, we're totally reframing the pre-Islamic Kaaba. We're looking at it not just as a religious shrine, but as an incredibly brilliant socioeconomic institution. Honestly, it was basically a desert cartel. So we have to start with the architectural mystery of this place. Picture the Arabian Peninsula back in the 6th century. It is this harsh, lethal environment entirely dominated by heavily armed tribes who are constantly locked in violent blood feuds. So why on earth would these warring groups cross unpoliced, deadly deserts just to visit a simple, roofless, dry stone enclosure? Because for most of its early history, that's exactly what the Kaaba was, just a modest, unroofed rectangle of stacked stones.
And this brilliantly illustrates our first major point. The Kaaba's power came entirely from the space it occupied, not from some grand architectural engineering. While surrounding empires were busy building towering monuments like Christian basilicas, or even the architectural marvels down in southern Arabia like the multi-story Gumdan Palace, the Kaaba was intentionally simple. It was simply an anchor in the open sand. Its authority wasn't in its walls at all, it was in the ground it sat upon. Now, the crucial thing to understand is that to the massive Byzantine and Persian empires of the time, this site was completely off their radar. You literally won't find explicit mentions of the Kaaba in Roman or Syriac records until much, much later. Historians actually call this the silence of the sources. But listen, it wasn't invisible because it didn't exist. It was off the radar because it operated as a strictly internal local tribal mechanism. It was a fiercely protected, neutral zone that simply didn't matter to the big world empires. That is, until it suddenly changed the course of global history. To really understand how this desert mechanism worked, we've got to look at a fascinating sociological concept the Bedouins called a Hauta. Basically, a Hauta was an ancient, highly respected neutral enclave, typically managed by a holy family or a lineage of seers. And in Mecca, the Quraysh clan mastered this exact system. They positioned themselves as the hereditary holy custodians of this sacred sanctuary. They weren't just acting as priests, they were essentially the supreme diplomats of a deeply fractured world. What makes the Haram test so incredibly fascinating is how its strict rules quite literally forced rival tribes to lay down their weapons and just talk. Inside the Haram around the Kaaba, all violence was legally suspended, no exceptions. You couldn't hunt, you couldn't even cut down the sacred trees, and most importantly, travelers and bitter tribal enemies were granted absolute, unquestionable immunity. It functioned like an ancient international court of arbitration, where disputes could finally be settled without sparking endless warfare. And as you might guess, where there's guaranteed peace, commerce absolutely explodes. Pilgrimage means people, and people mean trade. Because the sanctuary guaranteed safety, it naturally transformed into the uncontested economic hub of the Hejaz. Pilgrims brought in goods from all over the ancient world. We're talking leather, spices, textiles, perfumes, livestock. Massive, sprawling temporary markets would just naturally emerge right alongside the religious rituals. But here is where it gets wild. The Quraysh didn't just passively host these markets. They were brilliant, ruthless strategists. They literally weaponized their holy status to form a massive religious and economic cartel known as the Homs. The Quraysh and their closest allies basically designated themselves as the Homs, the elite, ultra-pure guardians of the sanctuary. And they used this audacious, self-appointed purity status to entirely dictate the terms of trade for everyone else in the peninsula. This setup created the ultimate pilgrim's trap. They managed to turn a captive market into a pure economic monopoly using sheer ritual purity laws. When outsiders arrived, the Humes dictated that their everyday tribal clothes were spiritually polluted by the secular world outside, so pilgrims were strictly forbidden from performing the sacred circumambulation, the tawaf, in their own clothes. They were left with two choices: buy incredibly expensive, specialized garments manufactured exclusively by Meccan traders, or if they couldn't afford those exorbitant cartel prices, they were legally forced to perform the ritual entirely naked. It's just a staggering display of economic dominance, completely masked as religious devotion. Now, to understand the actual product this cartel was managing, we have to totally erase our mental image of elaborate marble statues and look at Arabia's true historical context. Late antique Arabian polytheism was overwhelmingly aniconic, which means it largely rejected carved human or animal images. Instead, it was a deeply lithic culture, centered on the veneration of idols. These were sacred standing stones, unshaped blocks of basalt, or even meteorites. So the Kaaba wasn't some Greek-style statue museum, it was essentially a gathering place for sacred rocks.
Islamic tradition famously reports there were around 360 idols housed inside and around the Kaaba. Now, whether that number is literal or maybe symbolic, representing completeness like the 360 degrees of a circle or days in ancient calendars, it brings us to an incredible realization about what was basically their tribal market share. The Quraysh were systematically hoarding the spiritual capital of the entire peninsula.
By housing the sacred stones of dozens of independent tribes all under one roof, the Kaaba functioned as this massive federation of cults. Whether a specific tribe worshipped Hubal, Al-Uzza, Al-Lat, or Manat, their ultimate focal point was inside that dry stone wall in Mecca. It was a genius business strategy. It ensured every single politically independent clan saw their own identity represented there. It guaranteed that every tribe, no matter who they worshipped, became a paying customer of the Quraysh cartel.
And the space itself carried immense spiritual weight. It was widely viewed as the omphalos, the navel of the earth, or the literal starting point of creation, sort of like what Delphi was for the Greeks or Jerusalem for the Jews. The building's corners were even roughly aligned to the cardinal points and the rising of specific stars like Canopus. So when pilgrims performed that circular tawaf, walking around the structure, it likely held deep cosmological meaning, physically imitating the rotation of the heavens around a fixed secret center.
And it's absolutely vital to keep this in mind. The Arabs didn't worship the dry stone walls themselves. In ancient Near Eastern thought, a sacred stone or an enclosure wasn't the god itself. It was more like a local address. It was a physical anchor where unseen divine powers could make contact with the human world. The building was just an instrument. So when people came to Mecca, their devotion was directed at the cosmic forces they believed governed that specific square of desert sand. Which brings us to what might be the absolute most fascinating historical observation of all. When Islam eventually took over Mecca, it made a brilliant, truly unparalleled historical choice. It didn't bulldoze the infrastructure. Think about it. Conquering movements usually level the temples of their predecessors to build something entirely new, right? But early Islam dismantled the economic cartel of the Hums, shattered the lithic stones of the polytheists, but fundamentally kept the spatial structure intact. It basically recoded the theology rather than destroying the geography. By retaining these deeply familiar ancient rituals, Islam executed an absolute masterstroke of continuity. The physical sanctuary remained, the circular tawaf remained, the sacred months of peace remained, even the veneration of the pre-Islamic black stone remained. But Islam cleared all of them of their polytheistic tribal associations and linked them directly back to a grand universal monotheism under the Prophet Abraham. By doing this, Islam seamlessly secured the absolute center of gravity of the Arabian world. To ground all of this, let's quickly separate verifiable history from faith. The evidence heavily supports that the Kaaba was a major pre-Islamic site, operating as a Hauta that generated the incredibly lucrative Homs monopoly based on this ancient lithic tradition. What remains beyond independent archaeological verification, however, is the exact date the very first stones were laid, the specific inventory of those sacred stones, or external proof of its Abrahamic origins. The theology is a matter of faith, but the socio-economic cartel, that's a matter of historical record.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to ponder. We've seen exactly how the Quraysh managed a brilliantly complex sanctuary, and how early Islam preserved the physical actions of the space while completely revolutionizing their meaning. So if these ancient desert mechanics, the circling, the sacred months, the stones, survived the fall of the Homs cartel, what other modern daily rituals are still quietly echoing the incredibly rich, deeply complex world of the pre-Islamic past? That is exactly what you should take away from this explainer today. History rarely just erases. It adapts, it overwrites, and it endures.